Hi, this is Kevin. Today you'll learn about Kubernetes, an awesome technology that helps build robust, maintainable sites. So what is Kubernetes? Well, Kubernetes is a container orchestration technology. It helps you create basically an entire infrastructure, the database, the load balancer, and the application, and so on, in the cloud with one or two configuration files. The result is that you can set up applications with high reliability and scalability. And you can set up and tear down entire environments with a few commands. Let's see how this works. Kubernetes has nodes, which is kind of like a virtual machine, and each node has a pod. A pod is like an instance of your application. You can install any external container, like Microsoft SQL Server, a Redis cache, a load balancer, anything in a pod, just by specifying the container in a YAML file. Much like you can use any external library in your application just by referencing it. You can also specify how many scale sets or instances your apps should have, so that if one app breaks, another takes its place. Services act to group pods together, so traffic that goes into a service is redirected to one of the pods. The config maps are where you store application properties like connection strings. Persistent volume is storage. Usually it's the physical location where your database stores its data. Let's see how all this works in practice. As you can see here, I have already set up Kubernetes in Azure. Azure automatically sets up Kubernetes into two resource groups. The first resource group has just the Kubernetes cluster. The second resource group was created automatically. Its name consists of the cluster name and the region. This cluster has a network security group, two virtual machine scale sets, a load balancer, and a public IP address. Now you don't have to create all of these. Azure will create them automatically when you set up the Kubernetes cluster. To deploy containers to Kubernetes, you will need the kubeconfig file. It's a special file that allows you to deploy anything to a Kubernetes cluster. Next, we will need to containerize our application. You will need Docker Hub, which is a place to store all your containers. Building and deploying containers will eventually be part of your CI/CD process. But for now, let's build it locally. To do this, you need Docker Desktop and a computer with Hyper-V enabled. Next, we'll need to get our application ready. I've prepared a small .NET Core Razor Pages app for this small demo. It's a site called WatchTube, and if I run it locally, it looks like this. Now that we have an application, a Kubernetes cluster, and Docker, the next step is to containerize the application into a Docker container and push it to the registry. Then, push our container to the Kubernetes cluster. Let's see how this works. What are we trying to do here? We're taking source code and then asking Docker to build it and to put it into a container. So a container is like this package that contains everything needed to run the application. It contains your application and any libraries. It's like a tiny virtual machine that only runs your application. Next, I'll containerize the application by turning it into a Docker container and pushing it into the Docker Hub registry. The Docker file I'll use looks like this. The first part says that I'm using this Microsoft image to build a solution. Then I copy the source into the app directory. Then I build the solution. The second part says that I'll now use the ASP.NET runtime image. Then copy the binaries that were built in the first part into the app directory. Finally, I specify how to start the application with the entry point instruction. Next, I log into Docker with Docker login. Then I call this command to build a solution with the Docker file I just showed you earlier. This command will push the container I just built to the Docker registry. If you log in Docker Hub registry, you'll see the container there now. Finally, it's now time to push our container to that Kubernetes cluster we set up earlier. What are we trying to do here? Well, we've pushed the container to the Docker Hub registry. Now all we need to do is to deploy it to the Kubernetes cluster. The Kubernetes YAML file I will use looks like this. It looks complicated, but you'll get used to it. This YAML file is a deployment, which tells Kubernetes how to set up your container. In here, I specify that there will be 3 copies of WatchTube up and running for maximum availability. And every time there's an update, it should use a rolling update strategy. Finally, here's the location of the Docker container on the Docker registry to use. Here's another Kubernetes YAML file for the WatchTube service. A service groups a bunch of pods together. This service will redirect traffic from port 80 outside the network to port 80 inside the Kubernetes cluster. Now I will push the app into the Kubernetes cluster. I will do this with the command line, but of course this should all be part of your CI/CD process. First, I will set up the kubeconfig environment variable to point to the kubeconfig file that I had earlier when I set up the Kubernetes cluster. Next, I will run the kubectl apply and apply the deployment YAML files and the service files, and that will deploy the Docker container to the Kubernetes cluster. Our app should now be available for the public. If you run kubectl get pods and kubectl get services, you will see the 3 pods that were based on the YAML file earlier. This shows one service that is load balancing between the 3 pods. The external IP address is also shown here. So now, if you call the website with the external IP address, you will see the site come up successfully. Kubernetes is an awesome tool that helps make your sites robust and maintainable. A lot of large tech companies offer hosting Kubernetes clusters, notably Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. Special shout out to Linode and DigitalOcean as well. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this small video about Kubernetes. If you like this content about software, please hit like and subscribe. I hope you had a good day, and I hope to see you in a future video.